The Shadow Collectors, the Shadow Collectors. My name is Marcus, and this took place when I was a sophomore in college. When I didn't get a dorm after freshman year, I scrambled for off-campus housing. Long story short, I ended up in a co-op part of a three-house community that was sort of near campus, but not really. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap, and I didn't have many options. Plus, I had a motorcycle, so I didn't really mind the extra travel time. Most of the residents were young students like me, but there were a few exceptions. There were a handful of alumni, one or two TAs, and a few older people getting their degrees later on in life. But the person who immediately stood out to me was an older man who lived in one of the other houses. From what I could tell, he was maybe in his late 50s, even though he looked much younger than that. He had jet black hair that seemed artificially dark and walked with a peculiar gait, like he was floating just above the ground. He was really quiet and mostly kept to himself, and he always had this intense stare that seemed to pierce right through you. I assumed he had some kind of connection to the university, maybe faculty, or maybe an alumni, but no one explained, and I didn't ask. The first time I saw him do something strange was in our common kitchen, which was a little weird to begin with, because the two other houses had their own kitchen, so I wasn't sure why he'd be hanging out in ours. He wasn't cooking, or eating, or even talking to anyone. He was just standing there while the rest of us were talking and running around making dinner and listening to music. He didn't try and join in, he just watched us with those penetrating eyes. I caught his gaze with mine a few times, and part of me got the feeling that he was studying me specifically, even though I knew that was unlikely. No one acknowledged him, which I thought was extremely bizarre. Too, maybe they were afraid of something I didn't know about. Later that week, I was doing some homework in my room. When I saw him again, I glanced out my bedroom window, and there he was standing perfectly still in the courtyard, staring up at me. As if that wasn't strange enough by itself, he wasn't even on the walkway, but rather standing in the exact center of the grass. It was getting late, and there was a thick fog rolling in, so he must have been getting soaked out there. I couldn't tell if he was looking into my window or just in the general direction of the house, but I felt like those black eyes were boring into my soul. I don't know why I did it, but I waved at him, trying to be friendly. The moment I did, I instantly regretted it. He didn't wave back. Instead, he opened his mouth impossibly wide like a snake, unhinging its jaw, and let out this sound that wasn't quite human. It was like a cross between static and screaming. Then he turned and glided towards one of the other houses, presumably his. I felt physically ill. Not only had I acknowledged him, but I had confirmed that he had been watching my room the entire time, and even if he hadn't, he now knew which room was mine and had shown me something that defied natural explanation. Later that night, I asked one of my housemates about him. He told me that man had always been there, and that I should try my best to ignore him like the rest of them did, and never ever make eye contact. I inquired further about him, but the guy genuinely didn't know anything, and said he was just repeating what someone had told him when he moved in, along with a stern warning about never being alone with the man. It didn't sit right with me, so I asked around until I got some semblance of an answer. One of the seniors in the specific house he lived in told me that he was associated with the university as some kind of research subject and was a little more than kooky, but that he didn't have a history of violence or getting physical, though there had been incidents of people going missing after interacting with him too closely. I asked him why no one found that as terrifying as I did, and he told me that they really couldn't control who lived there, as that decision was up to the property manager and some kind of federal oversight program. I wasn't fully satisfied with that answer, but there was nothing I could do, so I tried to just block him out of my mind. But then it got exponentially worse. One night, I walked out of my room and nearly collided with him. He was in the hallway, standing right in front of my door, but the most disturbing part was that he was completely motionless, like a statue that had been placed there. I literally jumped back because he caught me so off guard. It was past midnight on like a Tuesday, so the house was mostly dead silent. He didn't say anything when he saw me. He barely even seemed to register my presence. Instead, he just turned 90 degrees and glided away, as if I were invisible, or perhaps as if I were the one who had intruded on his domain. I'm not going to go into every little detail, but there were several more occurrences like that one where I caught him either hovering somewhere where he had no business being, or doing something that seemed to bend the laws of physics, like walking through solid walls or appearing in rooms that had been locked. At some point, I lost my room key. All three houses had once been part of the same hotel, so all the rooms had personal locks and keys. It was a co-op, so most people just left their doors unlocked, but I was someone who couldn't sleep comfortably knowing someone could just walk into my room, especially someone like him. So losing my key was a catastrophic problem. Everyone had a spare, including me. But I was terrified because I'd have to go make a copy of the key, and that meant leaving my room unguarded for an extended period. A few nights later, I woke up randomly in the night. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it. There was a soft humming coming from my closet every 20 seconds or so. It sounded like some kind of electrical current, or maybe a tuning fork vibrating behind the door, like something was generating an electromagnetic field inside of my closet. I'm not one to scare easily, and I'm definitely not one to be helpless in a dangerous situation. So I was going to deal with this myself. I quietly got out of bed and grabbed a baseball bat I kept under my mattress. I slowly walked over to the closet, trying to keep my breathing under control. My heart was racing, and there was this metallic taste in my mouth, like I was tasting electricity in one fluid motion. I ripped the closet door open and screamed like a crazy person. Just as I expected, the man was in there, but he wasn't wearing any of my clothes. Instead, he was somehow suspended in midair with his arms spread wide and his head tilted back at an impossible angle. His mouth was open, and that humming sound was coming from deep in his throat, like he was some kind of human tuning fork. My scream must have disrupted whatever he was doing, because before I could react, he snapped his head forward and looked directly at me with those black eyes that now seemed to be glowing with their own inner light. He didn't lunge at me with a weapon. Instead, he opened his mouth even wider than before, and that static screaming sound filled the room so loudly that I thought my eardrums would burst. I swung the baseball bat at him, but it passed right through his body like he was made of smoke or shadow. He laughed, then a sound like breaking glass mixed with nails on a chalkboard, and suddenly, he was behind me. I spun around, but he was gone completely. Vanished. I yelled for help, and I heard some doors slam, followed by some of my housemates running down the hall. My friend Jake immediately helped me search the room, and the two of us checked every corner while someone else called the police, but there was no trace of the man anywhere. The rest of the night was a blur. The police got there quickly, but they found no evidence of an intruder and seemed skeptical of my story, especially when I tried to explain about the floating and the glowing eyes and the way he passed through solid matter like a ghost. By that point, my housemates were looking at me like I'd lost my mind, and honestly, I was starting to wonder if maybe I had the cops found my room key on my nightstand, which was impossible, because I definitely remembered losing it weeks ago, and it was somehow bent into a perfect spiral, like it had been twisted by some incredible force. A few weeks later, we got our answer about who he was. Apparently, he was part of some kind of classified government experiment that had been relocated to our area. The property manager had been paid a substantial amount of money to house him discreetly while he underwent some kind of psychological evaluation and treatment. The exact nature of the experiments was never disclosed, but from what we pieced together, it involved studying people with unusual abilities, or perhaps creating them. I believe the property manager was eventually arrested for violations of housing codes and possibly treason and rife. Only so, I honestly blame the government so much more for what happened than him. If anything, I feel like we were all unwitting test subjects in something much larger and more sinister, but my sympathy won't erase the fact that he tried to do something to me that night, something that might have changed me permanently. I could have lost my sanity, or worse, my humanity. I have no idea why he seemed so interested in me specifically, but I can only hope nothing like that ever happens to me again. I'm graduating soon, and I'm definitely going to miss college, but I don't think I'll ever be able to look back at my time here without thinking about that night and wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up in time. This isn't really my story, but I essentially watched the whole thing happen, so I'm telling it anyway. I've lived in a modest 2-story home with my husband Benjamin for the better part of 20 years now. All of our kids are out living their own lives, and I couldn't be prouder. But what I'm about to tell you happened last year when someone had just moved into the house across the street, which was really nice because I was getting sick of looking out at a vacant house all the time. I'm retired, so I spend a lot of time on my front porch knitting, reading, enjoying the weather with my husband, you name it. I also listen to a lot of true crime podcasts out there, and sometimes I'll just play music, but I also have this hobby of amateur astronomy, so I spend a lot of time with my telescope observing the night sky. The person who moved into the house across the street was a young woman, maybe mid-20s. She drove an expensive-looking Tesla and always dressed in flowing ethereal clothing. So I figured she was either very wealthy or seriously pretending to be some kind of spiritual guru. I hope I'm not giving the wrong impression about her. She seemed nice enough when she introduced herself to us after a few days. Her name was Luna, and she was a few years out of College, like I had guessed, she was a really quiet person and seemed to have an unusual relationship with Benjamin. They would have these long, intense conversations about philosophy and metaphysics, and Benjamin would come inside afterward looking strangely energized, like he'd been recharged by talking to her. Luna said she worked in alternative healing and that she did energy work for people with chronic illnesses, whatever that means. It kind of went over my head, but it must have been lucrative. She looked pretty well off. Like I said, she talked about crystals and chakras with Benjamin and told us about some of the spiritual experiences she was facilitating for her clients. All in all, she seemed like a nice enough girl, even if her beliefs were a little unconventional. Things were normal for a few months. Like I said, I spent a lot of time on my porch, so Luna would often wave to me when leaving her house, and I always waved back. But I started noticing through my telescope that she had some very strange nighttime activities. I can't remember exactly when, but I started noticing the same pattern every few nights. When I was out stargazing, I would see her in her backyard performing what looked like some kind of ritual or ceremony. She would light candles in specific formations and move around them in elaborate patterns while chanting or singing in a language I didn't recognize. She had her own ritual tools and altar set up, so it seemed like a regular practice. It became a predictable thing. Once, maybe twice a week, I'd see her out there during the new moon performing these ceremonies that would last for hours. I didn't really understand what she was doing, but people practice different religions these days, so I kept my thoughts to myself. Then one evening I saw something that changed everything. I was adjusting my telescope to look at Saturn when I accidentally focused on Luna's backyard instead of the sky. Luna was there performing her usual ritual, but this time she wasn't alone. There were other figures moving around her in the darkness, shadowy forms that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility like they were only partially there. They moved in ways that human bodies shouldn't be able to move, bending and contorting and stretching in impossible directions. It looked like she was conducting some kind of seance or summoning, but these weren't ghosts or spirits. They were something else entirely, something that hurt to look at. Directly, I couldn't catch what they were exactly, but I didn't need to. She was clearly communicating with them, gesturing and speaking in that strange language while they responded with movements that defied physics. Eventually, the shadows seemed to merge into the ground and disappear. Luna gathered up her ritual items and went back inside. I thought maybe I was seeing things through the telescope, but then I realized my husband Benjamin had been acting strangely lately too. He'd been taking long walks at night, which was unusual for him, and he'd been having these intense dreams that he would mumble about in his sleep, dreams about flying and traveling to other dimensions. I told myself it was just coincidence, but then I saw Benjamin's silhouette in Luna's backyard one night. When she was performing her ceremony, I watched through my telescope as he joined the circle of shadows, moving in those same impossible ways, his body bending and stretching like it was made of rubber or liquid. I wanted to scream or run outside, but I was frozen with terror, watching my husband of 20 years transform into something that wasn't entirely human. The ceremony lasted until dawn, and when Benjamin came home, he acted completely normal, like nothing had happened. But I could see something different in his eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before, like he was looking at me from very far away or from inside someone else's body. I didn't say anything at first, because what could I say? But then came the night everything went wrong. I had been watching Luna's house through the telescope. When I saw her emergency lights flashing, we rushed outside, joining the handful of neighbors who had come out to see what was going on. Luna's house was surrounded by police cars and ambulance, and what looked like federal agents, the whole 9 yards. We watched as they emerged from her house with several people in restraints, but they weren't handcuffs. They were these strange metallic devices that seemed to suppress some kind of energy or power. Luna was among them, but she looked completely different now. Her hair had turned white and her eyes were solid black, like she'd been possessed or transformed by whatever she'd been summoning. We saw Benjamin being escorted out separately. He wasn't under arrest, but he was clearly in some kind of altered state, walking like he was sleepwalking or hypnotized. We didn't see him for a week after that. I was worried, sick, and confused. When he finally came back, he seemed like himself again, but changed, somehow more aware of things that most people can't see. He let me ask questions without hesitation and told me everything. Apparently Luna, her name wasn't really Luna, had been part of some kind of interdimensional cult that specialized in opening portals to other realities. For starters, she wasn't supposed to be practicing those rituals in a residential area. She had been using the neighbors as unwitting anchors for her summoning ceremonies. According to Benjamin, she had been slowly recruiting people from the neighborhood and teaching them to serve as conduits for these shadow entities. Every time she had performed those rituals, she had been bringing more of these beings into our reality, and they had been possessing or merging with local residents. Luna had access to everyone's dreams and subconscious minds through some kind of psychic network, which I didn't even know was possible. She had been systematically taking over people's personalities and memories, replacing them with something alien and hostile, but worse stuff. All she had been preparing for some kind of mass possession event that would have transformed everyone in a 5-mile radius into hosts for these shadow creatures. The argument I thought I had overheard between her and Benjamin was actually Benjamin's consciousness fighting back against the entity that had been slowly taking him over. She had tried to complete the process that night, but Benjamin had managed to break free somehow and contacted the authorities. I'm not going to explain the rest, because honestly I don't understand most of it, but apparently Benjamin had been serving as a double agent, feeding information to some kind of government task force that specializes in supernatural threats. The doctor said the whole neighborhood had been an inch away from becoming a gateway for an invasion from another dimension. Benjamin and I tried to process what had happened, but we were both visibly shaken. The last thing he said before we went to bed that night was that he had learned his lesson about trusting people who seem too good to be true, especially when they show interest in your spiritual beliefs. Luna was transferred to some kind of secure facility, and we never saw her again. But we started noticing other houses in the neighborhood that had been affected by her rituals, people moving out suddenly, families disappearing overnight, strange sounds coming from empty houses. We ended up moving as well, because Benjamin said he could still feel the presence of those shadow entities, and that they might try to finish what Luna had started. No one should ever have to go through something like that, especially not in their own neighborhood where they thought they were safe. When I moved into my new place, I was just looking for a fresh start. I won't get into the details, but let's just say I had a bad situation with some supernatural entities that made staying in my old city impossible. I had inherited some money early in life and made some bad decisions about the kind of occult practices I got involved with. Lesson learned the hard way. The neighborhood I moved to is really nice, low crime, quiet, mostly families, but with a very specific quality that drew me there. It was built on what local historians call neutral ground, land that has been blessed by multiple religious traditions and is supposedly protected from supernatural influence. The houses here are really spaced out, which was partially what drew me there, but for some reason the property next to mine is much closer in proximity than most of the other properties are to each other. And by the way, that house next door is absolutely massive. When I first saw it, I thought it could easily house a family of 10 or maybe serve as some kind of boarding house. That's honestly what I assumed at first, that multiple families or maybe a religious community lived there, great-grandparents and everything. But I could not have been more wrong. Even though I tried to be low-key about my supernatural sensitivity, I wasn't going to be a rude neighbor. I took it upon myself to introduce myself to everyone in the neighborhood, but I made sure to do it during daylight hours and to wear the protective amulets that my previous experiences had taught me were necessary. For whatever reason, I decided to introduce myself to my next door neighbors last. I couldn't tell you why. Everyone else I met seemed really sweet and genuine. I'd say 90% of them were parents of young children, and yes, they were all slightly intimidating purely based on how successful and normal they seemed to be. I wasn't too sure how a younger guy like myself with a history of supernatural encounters would easily blend into a community like that, but that was more of a personal concern. When I got around to meeting my next door neighbor, my social battery was mostly drained from having spent the day making small talk with strangers and trying to seem normal. I knew if I just went back home, I was never going to be as motivated to meet them, so I just sucked it up and walked up their driveway. But as I got closer to the house, I started feeling this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was walking into a trap. I had gotten accustomed to being greeted by someone middle-aged and normal, so when a young-looking dude with an ancient-looking face opened the door, I was completely taken aback. He looked maybe 25, but his eyes were older than anything I'd ever seen, which was definitely shocking given my previous encounters with supernatural beings. I recovered quickly and went ahead with my new to the neighborhood spiel, but as I spoke I noticed that he wasn't breathing and his skin had a waxy quality, like it was artificial. As I went on, he flashed me this massive smile that revealed teeth that were too sharp and too white, and actually cut me off before I could even finish talking. He said something along the lines of, "Oh wow, someone who can see what I really am." What a delicious surprise. His voice had this harmonic quality, like multiple people speaking in unison. I tried to laugh it off and told him I wasn't sure what he meant, but he could see right through my act venting to him about how out of place I felt as a single guy in his late 20s among so many families with kids. But really I was trying to gauge whether he was dangerous. He told me not to worry about fitting in, and that most of the people who lived here kept to themselves because they were afraid, which was both a relief and a terrifying revelation for me. He introduced himself as Damien, but when he said the name it seemed to echo with power, like it was more than just a name, and told me I should come by for a drink sometime. I shrugged my shoulders and said, hell, why not right now? Because I figured it was better to know what I was dealing with immediately instead of wondering and worrying, to which I expected him to invite me in and show me whatever supernatural horror he was hiding. Instead, though, he looked over his shoulder like he was checking to make sure his victims were still properly secured, and then he turned back to me saying he wished he could, but he was busy feeding. I asked him what he meant by feeding, because it seemed like an important follow-up question to what sounded like a threat, and he dropped his smile completely after a long stare during which I felt like he was trying to read my soul. He laughed and just said, I consume the life force of mortals, but didn't elaborate any more than that, which confirmed my worst fears. I told him I understood and asked if he had any other residents or victims, to which he seemed genuinely amused. He told me he lived there alone with his collection, which was absolutely terrifying to me given how big the house was and what collection might mean in this context. We chatted for a few more minutes, and he gave me his number before going back inside, but I noticed he wrote it in what looked like blood. I was horrified that someone like him lived here, especially because he seemed like he was barely containing his predatory nature, but I couldn't figure out why he hadn't tried to attack me immediately. Maybe it was the protective amulets, or maybe he was playing a longer game. Anyway, I went back home and started researching everything I could find about him. That was about 6 months ago. For a few weeks after that, nothing eventful really happened. I texted Damien a few days after he gave me his number to try and figure out what he was planning, but he'd always respond with cryptic messages about patience and the right timing. Eventually, I gave up trying to get information out of him, not in a hostile way, just in a this guy is definitely going to try to kill me someday kind of way. I'm definitely not the type of person to ignore a supernatural threat, but I also wasn't sure how to handle something like him. I never saw anyone coming or going from Damien's place, no victims being dragged and no bodies being carried out, no delivery trucks bringing supplies, nothing. He never even seemed to leave the house himself, which was strange to me because his car was always in the driveway, and I genuinely didn't know how he was sustaining himself if he wasn't actively hunting. The guy lived like he was in some kind of supernatural hibernation. I work from home, and the office in my house is on the 3rd floor, which overlooks Damien's property. If you're wondering how I knew so much about his habits, I know it sounds obsessive and a little dangerous, but his house was also just a glance away from my monitor, so I couldn't help but monitor his activities from time to time for my own safety. One night, it was a Wednesday night. I remember that distinctly because Wednesday is when the veil between dimensions is thinnest. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of what I initially thought was loud music, but as I became more alert, I realized it was screaming. I sleep with my windows open and blessed salt on the sills, so that's probably how I woke up so easily. At first I thought I was having a nightmare, or it was part of a really vivid dream involving my previous supernatural encounters, but I was wrong. I got out of bed and peeked out my window, and there they were, 7 or so cars lined up in Damien's driveway. But these weren't normal cars. They were all black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was no mistaking it. He was having some kind of gathering. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the type to complain about some noise, especially supernatural screaming. I've heard my fair share of otherworldly sounds, but it was the middle of the week, and the volume was indicating that something major was happening. I figured I'd just observe from a distance and try to document whatever ritual or feeding frenzy was taking place. I threw on my protective gear and positioned myself at the window with a camera equipped with full spectrum recording capability. It was a full-blown supernatural event. That much was clear from the energy radiating from the house. I could feel it even through my protective wards, which was deeply concerning. I pulled out my phone to call my contact in the supernatural community, but I decided against it, knowing they'd probably tell me to evacuate immediately, and I needed to know what Damien was capable of. The following morning, I checked my recordings, but they showed nothing unusual, just normal footage of an empty driveway, which meant whatever was happening operated on frequencies that normal technology couldn't capture. I knocked on Damien's door to see if I could get any information about what had occurred, but to my surprise, when I reached for the handle, the door swung open inside. The first thing I noticed was that overwhelming metallic smell of fresh blood, at least 10 puddles worth. But there was something else. There was literally no one visible in the house, even though I could hear movement and whispers. I moved further in expecting to see bodies or evidence of whatever had happened, but it was completely clean. Aside from the smell, I could hear people talking over what sounded like chanting in the background, though, which I didn't understand. But then I really listened to it, and everything became clear all at once. It wasn't just voices, really. It was a recording, but not of normal human speech. It was the sound of souls being harvested. The whole gathering had been some kind of supernatural feeding ritual, all of it. But that didn't make sense to me. It still didn't explain the cars or the energy. I had felt there were definitely entities in that house. That much was certain. I should have turned around right then, but I needed to know what kind of threat Damien posed to the neighborhood. I moved carefully around the house until I saw a door that was slightly ajar and seemed to be emanating that same metallic smell. I gently pushed it open, and it led down to the basement. But this wasn't a normal basement. The stairs descended much farther than they should have given the house's dimensions. I'm not sure how I knew, but something told me what I was looking for was down there, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. It was dark down those stairs except for a very faint red light coming from somewhere I couldn't see. There was no reason to go down there. I knew that, but I also knew I might be the only person aware of what Damien really was. I got to the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The light was coming from another room somewhere deeper in what was apparently a vast underground complex. I crept towards it, and as I got closer, I started to pick up on another sound I hadn't been able to hear earlier. Over the chanting, it sounded almost like machinery, but organic somehow. It was this wet, rhythmic pulsing like a massive heart or breathing apparatus. I got a little closer, close enough to see through the doorway. There were 3 figures standing in there looking across the room at something that was out of view. But they weren't human anymore. They were tall and skeletal, with elongated limbs and faces that had been stretched beyond recognition. They were wearing what looked like ceremonial robes that seemed to be made of human skin and had symbols carved into their exposed bones. I also realized they were standing in pools of that same metallic-smelling liquid that I now knew was definitely blood. Under different circumstances, I would have assumed that they were demons or some other kind of supernatural entity. But given what I knew about Damien, I suspected they were former humans who had been transformed. I really wanted to see what they were looking at, but it was too far out of view, and I was terrified of what I might discover. After a few seconds of me just standing there trying to process what I was seeing, I started to pick up on this awful sulfurous smell mixed with something like rotting meat. That's what finally broke my paralysis. I started to feel this awful certainty that I was about to witness something that would drive me insane. I can't explain it rationally, but every cell in my body was screaming that I needed to leave immediately. I turned to flee, trying to be as quiet as possible. But as I was finding my way back to the stairs, I heard one of the creatures let out this howl that didn't sound like it came from anything that had ever been human. The sound seemed to vibrate through the walls and floors. I knew I had been detected. I sprinted up the stairs as fast as I could, but the stairs seemed to go on forever, like the basement was expanding. As I tried to escape, I ran through the house and burst out the front door, but instead of running directly to my house, I decided to circle around to the back to see if I could get a better view of what was happening in that underground complex. I jumped my own fence and made it to my backyard. I slipped in through my side door, locking it behind me, and immediately began activating every protective ward. I had. My chest was pounding, but under no circumstances could I let Damien or those creatures know it was me who had been snooping around. I gathered myself and went up to my office, making sure all the lights up there were off. I crouched down below the window and peeked over at Damien's house. The front yard looked normal, but then a few minutes later the ground itself seemed to bulge and shift, and like 8 of those skeletal creatures emerged from what must have been hidden entrances. They were scanning the yard, the driveway, the street, but they moved in ways that hurt to look at directly, like they existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. I could tell because everyone looked similar to those first creatures I had seen. A few of them seemed to be communicating through some kind of telepathic link that made the air around them shimmer. One of the beings actually pointed directly at my house, and I thought they were about to start approaching, but they didn't. Eventually, they all sank back into the ground and disappeared completely. Soon after that, I stood at the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about calling my contacts in the supernatural community, but what would I even say? That my neighbor was running some kind of transformation facility in his basement? There was no way they believed me without evidence, and I didn't have any recordings that showed what I had seen. The thing I couldn't understand was how none of my other neighbors seemed to be aware of the supernatural activity happening right next to them, especially since most of them had children who should have been sensitive to that kind of energy. I figured if they had been able to sense it, and I reported it to the authorities, Damien would know it was me, and I'd probably end up as his next victim. I had too many questions, and I didn't know who to trust, so I just tried to go back to normal life. The next morning I woke up and looked out my bedroom window. Damien's house looked completely ordinary again, but I noticed that his car was gone, which had never happened before. I went upstairs to try and get some work done, but I couldn't concentrate and found myself looking over at his property every 5 seconds, waiting for something supernatural to happen. After a few hours of his car not being there, I decided to go for a protective walk around the neighborhood, partly to clear my head, but mostly to check if any of the other houses were showing signs of supernatural influence. Nothing seemed obviously wrong, but I had this feeling like I was being watched. Days passed, and Damien still didn't return, at least not visibly. I was baffled with every passing day because I still couldn't figure out how my other neighbors were completely oblivious to what had been happening, so I decided to carefully probe them. I went to a few houses and casually asked them if they had heard anything unusual from the house next to mine a few nights ago. No one knew what I was talking about. Even after I described the timing and tried to gauge their reactions, I thought maybe they were all under some kind of supernatural influence or memory modification. That was a few months ago now. The really disturbing thing is Damien still hasn't returned in any way that I can detect, and it's clear no one is maintaining his house in normal ways, as the grass has grown wild and twisted into unnatural patterns, and there's a pile of packages by his front door that seem to shimmer and shift when I'm not looking directly at them. I don't know what to make of this. It could be that he's gone permanently, but I feel like entities like him don't just disappear. They transform or relocate or find new ways to continue their supernatural activities. I really have no idea, and the fact that none of my other neighbors seem affected by any of this makes me think I might be the only one who can perceive what's really happening. When Damien returns in whatever form he takes next, I'm debating whether or not I should try to contact him directly, or if I should just pack up and move to another neutral ground location before he decides I know too much about his true nature.